I just wanted to check in. I miss you all so much, and I just kind of wanted to take a moment to explain sort of what the next couple of weeks online, and then maybe into even the next couple weeks if we go past the April 15th date, how online school is going to work for me in my classroom. So I am going to be stepping it up slightly with the amount of work, just purely because A, I need to get all of your grades right on RunWeb, and then also B, I want to make sure that we're keeping up to pace. We also have 70 years of content that we still need to get through, and so for us to be able to make it to modern day, we need to keep pushing. And so this week we're going to be kind of doing 50s and 60s, and I will be showing you guys a video in just a second of my grandparents talking about life in the 1950s and 60s. But I did want to give you that heads up. I would need you guys to check in on Google Classroom on Monday, see what the assignments are, but I am going to give you a time to complete the assignment. So they're going to be due Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, and that way it'll pace you, and it will give you a couple of days to work on it ahead of time if you want to. I will also be having tests and quizzes because we need to keep that category going, and I want to make sure that you're getting this information. That being said, I know it's really hard to take notes on Nearpod, so what I will be doing is I will be sending you all of the notes from the Nearpod, and it will be open note quizzes and tests. So the next test will be next week, Friday. So I will give you all of the things that you need for that. I will send you the notes next week, and it will be open note. That being said, just a heads up, since it is an open note, and I want to make sure that you're actually getting this information, it will be less multiple choice and more essay. So, you know. So from this video, this is going to be my grandparents. They were born in 1944 and 1945, so they grew up in the 50s and 60s through childhood into college and young adulthood, and they're just going to be talking about their experiences. I do apologize if you hear weird noises in the background. There is a cornhole tournament happening at the same time as I was filming this video, so you're probably gonna hear some really weird noises in the background. But I hope that you get something out of this. What I would recommend doing is doing a split screen on your computer. So you do one half the Google form and the other half the video, so you can fill it out as you go and you can remember everything that they're saying. So without further ado, these are my grandparents. Go.
Good morning. My name is Paul Collins. I am the grandfather of your teacher, Mrs. Clark. I was born in June 22nd, 1944 during World War II. My father was in World War II. In fact, he was stationed over in Europe, and what was an interesting story, he was discharged in December of 1945. You know, the war got over in August there, 1945, and he wanted to be home to Illinois on Christmas Day. So the train, he got discharged, the train and some other GIs got into St. Louis on Christmas Day. There was no transportation coming to 130 miles away to Southern Illinois. So my father and four of the guys got a taxi cab, hired a taxi cab to drive 150 miles to bring him back to Southern Illinois. And so he did get home in time for Christmas Day, 1945. I would have been 1.5 years of age at that time. In the 50s, which I would have been in grade school and also a young teenager, I still remember things such as, this was the beginning. See, at the beginning in schools, there was no kindergarten. So in the 50s, began the half-a-day kindergarten. Also, too, I remember the 1950s. Prior to that, no seatbelts were in cars. And the first seatbelts were just around your waist as well. Of course, before there were these seatbelts, my wife and I, we just used our hand to stop any kid if they started coming forward. But of course, you see, prior to the 50s, there was no interstates. So we actually drove a lot slower. But beginning in the 50s with Eisenhower, interstates were built, like Interstate 66. And so people started traveling much further. You know, when I was a kid, we'd have maybe one vacation a year. And during the year, most of the time we wouldn't go over maybe 20, 25 miles away from home. maybe to go to Penny's store to get clothes for school. We'd go to Evansville, which is about an hour away, about 3 or 4 times a year. So traveling was much, much more limited until they started building the interstates under Eisenhower's presidency. But you know, I still think in 1950s, so important, under Eisenhower, he got added to our money, In God We Trust. In the 54, they got also added we are one nation under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. And also in the 50s and 59, the United States became 50 states. Alaska and Hawaii was added. And that was a big celebration at that time. Also in the 50s, the draft was still going on after World War II. And there were men that were being drafted that had to serve in the Korean War. As you probably have been studying, it wound up that really after the war was over, North Korea and South Korea remained the same boundary. But the reason why that was fought, of course, I can tell you, I'm a history teacher as well, was fought because the communists was trying to take over South Korea. And the United Nations got in to defend against North Korea and the communist countries like China and North Korea. But you know, in the 50s, I can still remember in the late 50s, early 60s, making maybe 50 cents an hour, up to $1 an hour, baling hay. We would also pick up Coke bottles, and you could take them to the grocery store and get 2 cents or maybe 5 cents for each bottle. And those days at the fair, they still had Coke bottles, and you'd go after the fair and just pick up these Coke bottles. And in the 50s, you could buy a bottle of Coke for a nickel, maybe even a dime in those days. But also the 50s was the days of the 55 and the 57 Chevrolet. Later on, that's what one of my first cars was a 55, 57 Chevrolet, and they were special. Of course, later on, never did have one, but you always dreamed of having a Corvette in the 60s or a Mustang in the early 60s as well.
How about the movies?
Oh yes, the movies back in those days, they were all G-rated, so you didn't have to worry about, and a lot of cowboy shows, a lot of comedies, and you could go for a double feature. And in between there'd be a cartoon, and sometimes there would even be a documentary on dealing with news, what's going on today. But now, of course, I lived in Southern Illinois, a small town, and in the 50s, I could get into a movie theater for a quarter. Later on, they raised it to 50 cents. But anyway, and also in the 50s, the late 50s, gasoline would be 25 cents a gallon. In fact, when I became 16 at the age of about 1960, quite often I'd go up to the filling station, I'd say, fill it up with $2. Because at that time, there wasn't the self-service as there is today. You'd be somebody that would fill it up for you and also clean the windshield. But that changed in the late 50s and 60s. Self-service gasoline stations also began at that time. Okay, Marilyn, your turn.
Okay, I'm Marilyn Collins. I am Miss Clark's grandmother. Actually, was born in June of 1945, so just a little bit year younger than my husband. What I do remember early in the 1950s, early childhood, my parents did a lot of gardening. The family did work together, and they were always gardening, picking fruit trees, gardening and canning and freezing food. We did a lot of that. In the early telephone I was going to mention, we actually had a live operator. And we picked up the phone, say number please, and we would give her the number. We also had party lines where there'd be, if it rang for us, maybe somebody else would get it at another house and other people would be talking. We could listen, but we weren't supposed to. Then later the dial telephone came in, and we actually had a rotary dial on the phone. And there was usually one phone in the whole house, and you had to, just take turns using it. I do remember when television started. We were in our house, my parents had the first television on the whole block. So everybody came to watch our television at first. I was born and raised in the Chicago suburb, and Chicago had 4 channels, channel 2, 5, 7, and 9. And at the end of each day, around, I don't know if it was 10 or midnight, At the end of the day, the television channel would play the national anthem and then be off. There was no all night long television at all. And of course, it was only black and white. So I do remember that very much. In the 50s, living near Chicago, that was right after the Second World War and also before the Civil Rights started. People were prejudiced. Sorry to say they shouldn't have been, but they didn't know any better, and they were prejudiced against the Negro people, and also especially the Japanese people. I remember as a young child, even as a child, you would look to see where your toy was made, and you would not buy anything made in Japan because it was just after the war, and they were prejudiced. Growing up in the 50s, children, styles, I thought you might be into styles. Girls wore dresses to school. We always had to wear dresses. We took lunches from home, ate at lunch, or walked home for lunch. We could do that. In the winter, we were not allowed to wear pants or jeans or anything like that, so we wore corduroy slacks under our dress. When we got to school, we'd take our corduroy slacks off and put them back on. We had to go outside again. And we always went outside at recess, no matter if it was cold, snowing, whatever, we just planned on it. In the late 50s, the styles changed. They were bobby socks. Bobby socks were thick socks with Oxford, black and white Oxford shoes. Ponytails, sweaters, and full skirts with lots of crinolines underneath. That was the style in the late 50s. When I went to high school, I back up before that. In 1959, my father had made he was part of handyman work that way. He made his own trailer, actually with Ford taillights, and it was a little 6x8 trailer with beds that folded out, and wood sides. We drove that in 1959 all the way up from Chicago suburbs to Alaska. It took 6 weeks, and it was through Canada. It was a wavy road, and then to Alaska it was only huge cobblestone roads. They weren't any paved roads back those days. So we went up and back in 6 weeks on a family vacation, and he had 6 blowouts and 5 flats. And when he took the tires back for their guarantee, I remember the man couldn't believe him that those tires wore out within 6 weeks, but he was still in good guarantee. So that was something special. That was 1959. We had a family station wagon, Chevy station wagon. My first car in 1960s was a 1950 Studebaker. Studebaker was a brand that's no longer in style. Then later it was American Motors was Ramblers and Nash cars, and they're not even in business anymore. And that gets us up to about the 60s, so I'll turn it back to Grandpa.
Okay. Leading up to the 1960s, I want to mention, of course, 1959 when Castro took over Cuba. America thought it would be all right because the former dictator was very crooked, and we did not realize that Castro then would make his country into communism and then lean towards an ally, Russia. So we didn't think much of it. So it was really a shock to the people of the United States whenever Cuba went communistic. And then I can still remember, because I would have been a teenager, 17, 18 years old, there was a lot of panic and distress in the United States because Russia, of course, was an ally with Castro, and we found out that they were bringing in missiles into Cuba, aiming them at the United States. And because of this, John F. Kennedy, who was a strong president, put a blockade of battleships around Cuba, wanting them to dismantle the missiles and return them to Russia. And so for quite a while there, we were on pins and needles. Would there be a Third World War? And so whenever they agreed to dismantle the missiles, Kennedy, we agreed that we would not attack Cuba. And because of that compromise, the Cuban Missile Crisis was calmed down. So that was a very big thing in the early 60s that kind of calmed the people. Of course, then also in the 1960s under Kennedy, he was very strong in the idea of the space program. Also very strong there of Peace Corps, young people out of college going and helping third world countries in ag or whatever specialty to have. But of course, in the 60s, the horrible, the assassination of Kennedy, and also of dealing with the civil rights, Martin Luther King was a major thing. I can still remember in '63, I was in college, and I'd come back from a class to the dorm, and someone said the president had been assassinated. And I said, no, that can't be true. But I can still remember that day coming back to my dormitory at Thomas Hall at Eastern Illinois, and it was such a shock to the young people at that time. And so, in the early 60s. Also in the 60s, was very popular rock and roll music. Elvis Presley and many of the other early, and the music is still popular today, and the rock and roll music. Of course, the civil rights movement made a lot of news dealing with, especially in the South, when not allowing the blacks to dealing with eating in certain restaurants. I do familiar with. I'm a baseball fan, and some of the Major League Baseball early black players had to eat at separate restaurants and so forth. But eventually, with the civil rights movement, it denied not allowing that blacks and whites both could stay in the same hotel and the same restaurants, and also transportation. That was a big thing in the 60s. Also in the 60s, a big thing that affected people my age at that time, because I was, like I say, in my 20s, was the Vietnam War. A lot of young men were being drafted into the Vietnam War. I was very fortunate. Like I say, I was a teacher, and there was a big shortage of men teachers at that time. Also, my wife and I were married, and she was expecting, and because of that, my number on the draft was way down, and so I did not have to serve in the Vietnam War. But dealing with the protests at the colleges, but the idea of the war was, of course, trying to stop communism from spreading. But that was a big thing in the 60s. Another thing in the 60s that you'd see on TV, it'd be black and white TV probably still, would be the space program. But to see our space program at first, we think of Alan Shepard. But what really got things going is Russia beat us in the space program, sending the first man in space. Because of that, we started spending a lot more money in science and in math programs. And so we were able to, of course, in '69, be the first to send a man to the moon. So it was that competition. That was part of the Cold War still. Not only the competition there, but if you recall, Soviet Union and the Cold War would always support opposite of who we supported. We supported South Vietnam. They supported North Vietnam. Likewise, they would support North Korea. We would support South Korea. That's all part of the Cold War.
I got a question for you, Grandpa.
Sure.
I got two questions that I know that my students would really like me to ask.
Sure.
So, there's a conspiracy theory that JFK was assassinated by somebody else or assassinated by the government. Do you think that's possible?
Well, so far, they've not proven that to be true yet. But it is an interesting theory. I don't go along with those two theories.
Okay.
But yeah, but like I said, there's strong theories about that. But of course, the assassinator didn't live very long, so they could interrogate him to see if there was somebody else that was conspiracy.
Right.
But what I read, there's no still solid evidence to prove otherwise. But will we ever know?
I guess not.
I don't know if we'll ever know. But
I got one other question.
Yeah.
Do you think that the moon landing was faked, or do you think that it was real? That it really happened when they said it did?
Oh, it really happened because there was a Collins as one of the three.
That brings some integrity, right?
Integrity.
That Collins
now, of course,
name.
Armstrong and Aldridge were the two that actually put foot. But the third astronaut, Collins, remained aboard the capsule to be sure that they could get back safely. So that's some integrity there. No, I do not believe it was fake. There'll always be some skeptics, but there's enough hard evidence to prove that.
It actually happened when the government says it did.
We beat Russia. Okay, Marilyn?
Okay. He took a lot of the same things that I was going to talk about. Records, record players and radios, those were the things that teenagers listened to. We all had our own record players. Well, records got to be really popular. That's what teenagers talked about. We went to people's houses, we listened to their stash of records and playing them over and over again. And radios, of course, radios, and they were little tiny pocket transistor radios. That became popular about that same time. So that was the first one of the small electronics. He mentioned when President Kennedy was shot. I do remember that day. I was in high school, I was a senior that year, and I was in a choir class. And high school, I'm at a big high school, about 3,000 people, kids rather. Anyway, we were in choir, and they actually announced it over the intercom, and I remember our teacher got a television, and then we were listening to the news. Every class was listening to the news after the rest of that day. So I do remember it. It's kind of like the thing for 9/11. People remember where they were at that particular time. I really don't have any more about the 60s. After that, we got married in 67, and then that changed. Everything changed. So my college years, but
You know, I want to emphasize, we was talking about things were cheaper, but people's salaries was a lot less. For example, in 1966, when my first year teaching, my salary was $5,000. But yet that was sufficient. You know that, because the rent or the food and so forth. So nowadays the salary is a lot higher, prices are a lot higher, so it's comparable. But at that time, $5,000 seemed to be a lot of money. In 1966, 1967, I got a raise to $5,500.
Ooh, big spender there.
Right. But anyway,
I might mention if teenagers are doing a lot of babysitting, my first jobs of babysitting was 50 cents an hour.
Wow.
And I know now our adult kids are paying $10, $20. I don't know how much they are nowadays, but so we lived through it, and when you kids are growing up, you'll have things that are different too. The technology is our big things to go different now.
Yeah.
But there'll be what you think is popular now will be old-fashioned someday.
Well, I appreciate it, you guys. Thank you very much.
keep up the good work
Thanks. Enjoyed
and
it.
teaching. Thank you for having us.